In this video, I will show you how to evaluate these trig functions at these angles using sum or difference identities. I'm talking about these identities right here. Now, when I see this 285 degrees, I would be more comfortable converting this to radians. So I'm going to take 285 degrees and I'm going to multiply it by pi over 180 radians. Alright, so basically I have 285 pi over 180. So now I'm reducing. Pretend this is a four-function calculator. So 285 divided by 5 and 180 divided by 5. So far that's 57 over 36. So now I've got 57, whoops. I've got 57 pi over 36. Okay, both of these are divisible by 3, so I'm going to do that. Alright, so 57 divided by 3, and of course 36 divided by 3 is 12. So I've got 19 pi over 12. So this problem is the same thing as having the tangent of 19 pi over 12. Okay, so I'm more comfortable with that, but still, now what do I do? This is not one of the special angles that I have memorized, so I have a strategy for converting this into the sum or difference of the special angles, which are, the reference angles are pi over 4, pi over 6, or pi over 3. So if I start with 19 pi over 12, and I subtract pi over 4, okay, this will probably give me a special angle. In order to have like denominators, I'm going to have to multiply by 3. So this is going to give me 16 pi over 12. Now I'm just going to reduce everything that I can. So 19 pi over 12 minus pi over 4 is equal to, let's see, both of these are divisible by 4, so this is going to be 4 pi over 3. Now adding pi over 4 to both sides, I discover that 19 pi over 12 is equal to pi over 4 plus 4 pi over 3. So this is the substitution that I can now make. So this original problem would be the same thing as having the tangent of pi over 4 plus 4 pi over 3. Okay, so now I am going to do the tangent formula. And the tangent formula goes, well, let me just show it to you. It goes tangent plus tangent over 1 minus tangent tangent. Alright, so this is going to be tangent of pi over 4 plus tangent of 4 pi over 3 over 1 minus tangent pi over 4 tangent 4 pi over 3. Okay, this mess is going to be in the way, so I'm just going to go ahead and erase that. So let's simplify as much as we can. The tangent of pi over 4 is just 1. Okay, that's a fact that we have memorized. The tangent of 4 pi over 3. Well, the reference angle is pi over 3. We have memorized that the tangent of pi over 3 is radical 3. That's just something that we memorize. So the tangent of 4 pi over 3 will either be radical 3 or it could be negative radical 3. That just depends on the quadrant. So in my mind, I'm picturing this, guys. Ha! That was a horrible circle. Over here on the left, this is pi. Alright, reference angle pi over 3, this would be the same thing as 3 pi over 3. Now 4 pi over 3 would just be one more past this. So this would be where 4 pi over 3 is. This is definitely in the third quadrant. And tangent is positive in the third quadrant. So I'm going to leave this positive radical 3. Okay, so continuing on, now in the denominator, I have 1 minus, tangent of pi over 4 is 1, but 1 times anything, it stays the same. So this is, I'm not going to write this down. And tangent of 4 pi over 3, as we just discussed, is radical 3. So I have 1 plus radical 3 over 1 minus radical 3. And that's as far as we need to go. So this is the final answer for problem number 1. Okay, for problem number 2, 75 degrees is obvious enough how to split it up into special angles that I'm just going to stay in degrees. Now in degrees, the special angles are 30 degrees, 45 degrees, and 60 degrees. And since 30 plus 45 is 75, that means negative 30 plus negative 45 degrees is going to give you negative 75 degrees. So one way to do this would be to do the sine of negative 30 plus negative 45 degrees. Alright, because that would add up to negative 75. So the way the sine formula works, it goes sine, cosine, cosine, sine. So that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to do sine of negative 30, cosine of negative 45, okay, plus cosine of negative 30, sine of negative 45. Okay, now I know that sine of 30 degrees is 1/2. Alright, that's something that we have memorized. But what about the sine of negative 30 degrees? Well, it's just a matter of the quadrant. Okay, negative 30 degrees is means that we're going 30 degrees this way. Okay, so both negative 30 degrees and negative 45 degrees will be here in the fourth quadrant. So sine of 30 degrees is 1/2, but sine of negative 30 degrees is going to be negative 1/2 because sine is negative in the fourth quadrant. It's a y value. Cosine of 45 degrees is radical 2 over 2. Alright, cosine of negative 45 degrees is still radical 2 over 2 because cosine is positive in the fourth quadrant. Alright, cosine of 30 degrees is radical 3 over 2. And again, cosine is positive in the fourth quadrant, so I'm just going to leave it like this. And sine of 45 degrees is radical 2 over 2. But sine of negative 45 degrees will be negative radical 2 over 2 because sine is negative in the fourth quadrant. So now it's just a matter of simplifying this down. So I have negative radical 2 over 4. Okay, and I could say plus negative radical 6 over 4. Or I could have just said minus. And I'm definitely going to say minus right now. So this is going to be negative radical 2 minus radical 6 over 4. So this is the final answer for problem number 2. Okay, so I have negative 5 pi over 12. And I need to figure out how to split this up into special angles. So I'm going to start by subtracting pi over 4 from both sides and see what happens. So minus pi over 4. Okay, so I'm going to have to multiply by 3. So that would give me negative 8 pi over 12. Okay, so I've got negative 5 pi over 12 minus pi over 4. I'm just simplifying, so this is going to be negative. Dividing both of these by 4, that's going to be 2 pi over 3. Adding pi over 4 to both sides, I have negative 5 pi over 12 is equal to pi over 4 minus 2 pi over 3. So this is the substitution that I can make. So this problem would be the same thing as having the sine of pi over 4 minus 2 pi over 3. I might need this space, so I'm going to go ahead and erase this. Okay, now I'll go ahead and finish the problem. The sine formula goes sine, cosine, cosine, sine. So this is going to be sine pi over 4 cosine 2 pi over 3 minus, alright, because if it's subtraction, it stays subtraction, cosine pi over 4 sine 2 pi over 3. Sine, cosine, cosine, sine. Alright, so it is time to evaluate this. So sine of pi over 4, we've memorized that that is radical 2 over 2. Cosine 2 pi over 3. The reference angle is pi over 3. So what's the cosine of pi over 3? 1/2. So this will either be 1/2 or negative 1/2. The question is, what quadrant is 2 pi over 3 in? Alright, 2 pi over 3 is like right here. So that's in the second quadrant. Cosine is negative over there because it's an x value on the left. So this will be negative 1/2. And then cosine of pi over 4 is radical 2 over 2. And sine of 2 pi over 3. Well, the reference angle is pi over 3. Sine of pi over 3 is radical 3 over 2. But maybe it's negative radical 3 over 2. Well, we're in the second quadrant, and sine is positive in the second quadrant, so I'll just leave it alone. So that's going to give me negative radical 2 over 4 minus radical 6 over 4. So that's negative radical 2 minus radical 6 over 4. So that is the final answer for problem number 3. Alright, so we have 13 pi over 12. So I'm going to do my little magic off to the side. 13 pi over 12 minus pi over 4. Let's see what we get. So again, I'm going to have to multiply by 3. So that's going to give me 10 pi over 12. So that means 13 pi over 12 minus pi over 4 is equal to, dividing by 2, that's going to be 5 pi over 6. Adding pi over 4 to both sides, I have 13 pi over 12 equals pi over 4 plus 5 pi over 6. So this is the substitution that I can make instead of 13 pi over 12. So this would be the same thing as having cosine of pi over 4 plus 5 pi over 6. Okay, the cosine formula goes cosine, cosine, sine, sine, and it's going to change from addition to subtraction. So it goes cosine pi over 4 cosine 5 pi over 6 minus sine pi over 4 sine 5 pi over 6. Alright, cosine, cosine, sine, sine. Notice the change from addition to subtraction. That happens for cosine. It goes from addition to subtraction or subtraction to addition. But for sine, addition stays addition, subtraction stays subtraction. Anyway, cosine of pi over 4 is radical 2 over 2. We've just memorized that. What about cosine of 5 pi over 6? Well, the reference angle is pi over 6. And we've memorized that the cosine of pi over 6 is radical 3 over 2. The only question is, will it be negative radical 3 over 2? To answer that, we just consider the quadrant. Okay, over here on the left is pi. Reference angle pi over 6 makes me think about the fact that pi is 6 pi over 6. So 5 pi over 6 is 1 less than that. Alright, that puts us in the second quadrant where cosine is negative, x value on the left. Okay, sine of pi over 4, that is radical 2 over 2. Sine of 5 pi over 6. Well, the reference angle is pi over 6. Sine of pi over 6 is 1/2. The only question is, should it be negative 1/2? Like I said, we're in the second quadrant, but sine is positive in the second quadrant, so I will leave it positive 1/2. So now it's just a matter of simplifying this, so I'm going to have negative radical 6 over 4 minus radical 2 over 4. So the final answer will be negative radical 6 minus radical 2 over 4. Alright guys, that's going to do it for this video. Go ahead and click here in the red apple to watch the next video. Click in the green apple to subscribe, or click the yellow apple for the full playlist.